All right, welcome to chapter 6 here. We will be going through more of the physiology than anatomical aspects of the bones here, which I like more because it's more useful than just knowing bone names. I mean, I guess as nurses, you'll need to know bone names. But anyway, this is more exciting for me. I think it will be more exciting for you too. So remember, what is the role of the skeletal system here? It's the framework to maintain the body's shape and structure, provides locomotion for us, it's protection, as well as housing organ systems, right? With the cranium and the thoracic cavities. So it's there for support, protection, movement and storage, and cell production, which were the minor ones I mentioned last in chapter 7 as the ones we don't really think about, but they also are vital importance for proper functioning of the human body, for storing calcium and phosphates, and as well as producing bone, blood cells, and other things. So there are different tissue types in bone. In the skeletal structure that we'll really talk about here, the first one off is cartilage. Cartilage is there for providing surfaces of bones with a low friction surface, really there for protecting the bones and providing those low friction surfaces at joints for movement, right? The big one that we think of, which is imaged here. Does anyone know what's imaged here? The bone? Right, it's the femur, right? And that cartilage is covering the head, right, of the femur itself, right, in the hip bone. So there's 3 different types of cartilage. There's hyaline, which is a glassy, and it forms on top of articular surfaces. Then we have fibrocartilage, and then elastic cartilage. Where hyaline is the hardest, fibrocartilage is like it's still hard, but has some softer, elastic, like rubber band properties. And then elastic cartilage is the softest and most elastic. Now, the cells that are responsible for forming the cartilage are chondroblasts and chondrocytes. Now, chondroblasts actually produce the cartilage matrix protein structure itself. If we're talking about a cell inside of the cartilage that maintains the cartilage, repairs it, those are called chondrocytes. So blasts produce, cytes live inside of. And we'll see that motif also when we talk about bone cells as well. There's the connective tissue perichondrium, has multiple layers to it. The main 2 layers that we'll see here is that there's going to be an inner and an outer core here on these cartilage tissues. One is where you will have soft, more delicate, easily broken protein fibers where the chondroblast will be residing on the surface, right? And then there's an outer layer where you'll have blood vessels and nerves potentially that could penetrate a little bit. You're not going to have blood vessels inside the cartilage itself. It's just going to be a little bit inside of it, like on the surface, right? Because you need to get close enough for the diffusion, but you're not going to have like true blood vessels inside of the cartilage itself. Now, talking about bone matrix here. So the bone is actually a crystal in the protein structure. So crystal as in, yes, glass or crystal china ware and stuff like that. The bone is made up of 2 different types because of this. So 35% of it is considered organic, where it's made up of proteins and proteoglycans. Protein is really called collagen in this case. Then there's an inorganic component, which is the rest, which is 65%. Which is made up of a crystal called hydroxyapatite, and there's the chemical makeup. This is where you have your calcium and phosphate. Look at that. Like we talked about, like in the previous review of its role. Now, if you remove the inorganic hydroxyapatite crystals, or what we will call them minerals, is what most people call it by, the bone becomes very bendable very more rubber band-like, right? Like this in figure B. Now, if you remove the protein, collagen, and organic part, what happens is the bone becomes so stiff and it becomes more like glass and very brittle and shatters, like this image here. So both are needed to give us the proper, bone properties that the body needs for functioning. Now, similar to cartilage and chondrocytes, we have osteoblasts, which make the bone, osteocytes, which are bone-making cells inside of the bone, but unlike cartilage, we'll have osteoclasts, in this case, that will break down the bone, right? So we have our blasts, which make the bone, our clasts, which destroy and reabsorb the bone, and osteocytes, which live inside the bone, right? Which the important thing to note here is osteoblasts come from a bone stem cell lineage, versus osteoclasts actually come from the hematopoietic stem cell lineage, which is our blood cells. So they come from two different families per se, but are involved in maintaining proper bone health. So osteoblasts, they lay down the bone, and this is over a course of time. They'll lay down the collagen as well as the hydroxyapatite, precursors of it, which then matures into hydroxyapatite via, just chemical reactions there. But the osteoblasts lay down the minerals and the proteins needed for proper bone. And then as some of the osteoblasts get entrapped in the bone, they're called osteocytes, and they help maintain the bone. So they mature the bone, they maintain it. Interestingly enough, they live in small spaces. Really, any small space in the body is called the lacunae. But they do have little tunnels that connect osteocytes together, because remember, cells don't like to be lonely. They like to have neighbors. But in this case, it's more like countryside, estates where you have distant neighbors that they communicate with via little canals called caniculi, right? Okay, hard to see in this figure here, but there are little canals. This is where nutrients can move through, and cells can send signaling molecules to one another to orchestrate cellular activity. Osteoclasts, on the other hand, they like to destroy cells, bone, really the bone matrix. They don't kill other cells, just the bone matrix. They use enzymes and acid, hydrogen protons, or protons to form an acid to degrade the bone. And this kind of image kind of shows it. There's a high ruffled bordered region that creates a large surface area that then they release the enzymes and the acid into this pit, where they will uptake the calcium and the phosphate and release it into the body. The body replaces all of the bone mineral every 10 years, depending upon what type of bone mineral we're talking about, based on how dense the bone matrix is. It either will be replaced every 2 years or every 10 years. So we just say every 10 years, the atoms and molecules in your bone are completely replaced, which is a good thing. And this is where we talk about this. So there's kind of two different bone structures. We're going to talk about the crystal structure here. One is woven and one is lamellar. Really, it's when we're talking about mature adults, there's the lamella bone and then there's the cortical bone. But when a bone is maturing here, if first in a young adult or fetal development and growth and fracture repair here, you have what's woven bone, where the protein, collagen, is not orientated well and there's not much hydroxyapatite. But as the bone matures, the collagen becomes more organized by the osteoclasts here, when making what's called lamellar bone, which just kind of forms like a sheets of that we'll see here in the next slide here. So there's trabecular bone here, and then there's cortical bone. They all have the lamellae kind of bone orientation in the sense that the bone is orientated, but really in side of the cortical bone, we see more of this structure, more pronounced at a visible level. But we can see here in these struts in the trabeculi here, we see this lamellae, right? These concentric rings per se. Those are what we're talking about, where you have the woven bone structure that's not really organized well. And then as the osteoblasts are maturing those bones and orientating the protein structure, the collagen, and the hydroxyapatite crystals, you really get to see, this orientation of the bone crystal itself into like little rings like this, as well as it's angled, the crystal itself. So these spongy-like bone, trabecular bone, is both at the femur head and in the skull. This is a place where you have marrow filled in with, and it's really along places where lots of stress is formed, say like jumping and running, right? That's where you find it at your joints in your femur and your knee. But it also houses that red bone marrow that the red cells are living in, right? The stress lines you can see here and the red lines, right? Normal walking, running, and jumping. These trabeculi struts align with those to, kind of pass those stress from running and jumping down the bone. Then we have cortical bone here. So this is the most compact bone type that we have. It's very solid. It does not look like trabecular bone, but it has typically a central or a central cavity towards the medial side of the bone, where you have the yellow bone marrow, because you're not going to have like a spongy-like look to it. It's going to be pretty dense. But the cortical bone itself has osteons, which is those concentric rings of the lamellae bone crystal, which we'll see here, and as well as it has little canals that blood vessels and nerves can travel through to provide nutrients to the osteocytes and osteoblasts in that bone. Let's just get into the image here, because there's a lot of words. So the cortical bone here is really found at the lateral side of the cortical bone itself, or in the big bone itself. You can kind of see it here, image A. You see that dense bone. That's what we're really looking at. So you can see the lamellae concentric ring structure here, right? That's an important property of bone. It helps actually strengthen the bone by having, interesting orientation there. You have the osteocytes living in their little homes, the lacuna, with the caniculate canals connecting them. Then you have this central canal here, also called the Haversian canal, where you can have nutrients flow through. And you can see that here, right? Blood vessels come into those canals, right? And so these bones are not just like cartilage where you think they're just solid all the way through. They actually do have canals and cavities for which blood vessels and nerves and nutrients can pass through and get to the cells to keep them alive, right? Because this is dense material, so you got to get your blood vessels close to them. So just more information. So the osteons are those organizational main units of the cortical bone, right? So that's the main thing here. It's the main organization unit of the cortical bone. They have lamellae concentric rings around the canal. And then you have perforating canals that bring in blood into the central canals, right? So I think we'll pause the video there. I think this is a good stopping point, and then I will see you in the next video.